Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Hey everyone, B1B Flyer here, and in this video I'm going to show you how to paint Natasha Kerensky's Widowmaker. These are the colors that Natasha used during her time in the Dragoons Black Widow Company, and would continue to use throughout her career. For paints I've got black, Vallejo extra opaque heavy charcoal, secret weapon miniatures rubber highlight, which you could also substitute with Vallejo's neutral gray and adding a little bit of blue, or perhaps a lighter gray if you wish. For the accent colors I've got blood red, gory red, gunmetal, and dark tone, but you can use any reds or metallics that you have available to you, as well as a black wash. Outside of base coating, here's the brushes that you'll need to execute this scheme the way that I did. I've got a 0 nice pointed tip Kerensky brush, and then I've got a small dry brush, a large dry brush, and an eye makeup brush that I use for dry brushing as well. You can see I've started by priming the miniature black. If you don't have a black, or you don't get even coverage, maybe because you're using an aerosol can, then feel free to put a base coat of black over the primer before you begin. Now, to make things easier later on and allow for the easiest touch-ups, I've started applying gunmetal into the recessed areas and anywhere I want to have metallic. And the reason I'm doing this is that a lot of these areas are recessed, so if I were trying to do it after I've done some highlighting with dry brushing and change the overall color other than black from the miniature, the touch-up process is much more complicated and a lot easier to get difficult to match the colors with. So if you start painting these now, anything you get that might get outside of where you wanted it to be, you can just touch it up with the basic black and it's a one color fix. It also helps when you're getting into those joints and areas that are kind of tight spaces, so it's a lot less stressful to just touch up the area that you get a little bit on. Once you're happy with the amount of metallic highlights or details that you want to paint, grab some of that black and take a look at the miniature and see if there's any spots that you might have gotten paint where you didn't intend. It's a pretty simple process. Just thin your black a little bit. It tends to be a thicker paint. And just go around and find those edges or areas that you want to reinforce. Maybe the vents got a little too much silver in them, or gunmetal, or whatever color you're using. But this is the easy way to fix everything now. When you're happy with all the details being cut in, it's time to grab the charcoal and that wide dry brush. And we're not actually going to dry brush with it, we're going to overbrush. So I'm going to use some unthinned paint from the bottle and a paper towel. I'm going to load the bristles up, and I'm going to wipe off a good amount of the paint, but I still want wet paint on the brush. And I'm going to treat it the same way I would if I was dry brushing, working in a top-down motion. And what I'm doing is creating the top edge highlight color while still maintaining a lot of the black in the recesses as well as on the lower sides and surfaces. You can be as aggressive or as reserved with this as you wish. If you don't like it, you can always go back in and move back under the black, or even do the opposite direction with the black until you've got a reduced amount of the gray showing. Keep in mind it will mute out as it dries, so it's going to look brighter both because of my lights at the desk and because it's still wet while it's on this video. I'm not using a whole lot of paint at once, and that's the one thing that can really get you. If you load your brush up too much, you're going to end up spreading paint all over as though you were just trying to do a base coat. This can take a little bit of practice and get the technique down. I suggest you try it out maybe on the base of the miniature so you can get an idea of how you should drag your brush over to not load the paint up, as well as what amount of paint your brush that you're using will hold, to see if you can get that figured out before you start applying it to the miniature. You do want to try to go over the edges and go perpendicular to those points as much as possible. It's not going to be completely doable based on just the fact that it's a three-dimensional object, but you want to, again, treat it like you're trying to just catch those raised high side edges that would catch the light. The other option, if you don't like this process and you don't want to have as much gray, or maybe it turns out it is a little bit too bright for you based on the colors you're using, you can do a wash. You could put a black wash over it after this step, and that would be fine. It will mute out a lot and it'll put some more defined black into the recesses. I'm not going to do that in this process to show you that you don't have to do it, but again, that is an option if you prefer that style. Don't worry if you make any mistakes or you get some of the paint where you don't want it to be on the black. You can go back in and touch it up using a very thinned black, almost like a glaze, or you can just reset on the panel, let it dry, and then do this over again. It's really a back and forth until you're happy with it, and if you get it right the first time, there is no back and forth, but don't be afraid to fix it. As I start to work the upper raised surfaces, the areas that are going to be most easily seen, you can see I'm just using a light pressure. I'm kind of changing the direction to make sure that I get all the edges and corners and everything. Every panel gets some of this charcoal gray onto it. Again, I'm not really aiming to change the color. I want the black to show through. I want the black to still be present. So if you're getting a panel highlighted or painted in this sense, and you're happy with a little bit of the black in the middle showing, or you want to lean towards one side or the other, say the top edge or the side, that's again another technique that you can do to really make it unique and make it your own. One final note, if you have some areas that are hard to get to and you still want to get some color, you can use that smaller dry brush to achieve the same thing. I'm just using the larger brush to cover a larger area in the least amount of time. And with the charcoal applied, here's how it looks. Not looking for total coverage in every area, but you can still get the black definition in the recesses. The next step, you're going to want to use that makeup brush, the round dry brush. And I've also got the Secret Weapon Miniatures tire highlight. Put a little paint on the brush and then put it on a paper towel to get the majority of the material out. Work it pretty good for those first load up on the brush, just to make sure you don't have any wet and damp areas in the center. And then using the light brush pressure, working top to bottom, trying to catch angles perpendicularly, cover the entire miniature with the rubber highlight. If you don't have this color specifically, you can take a light gray and experiment mixing with a blue. I can't tell you the exact recipe because I didn't make it. Just find something that you like that's similar, or even another manufacturer's color that might be similar. If you don't want to use the blue-gray, you can also just use a regular light gray. Just try not to go too light, as it might be a little bit too much contrast on the dark areas of the miniature with the bright gray, and it tends to lead your eye into thinking it's more of a gray miniature if you do that. Remember, you can always go back and add more, so if you start out light and it's just not quite bright enough, at least you can go back in and kind of hit some areas to reinforce them. Just picking out details, it's kind of hard to get the brush into some of the recessed areas, and that's okay. Again, afterwards, if you have some areas that you're not able to get to on a miniature, you can go back with a smaller dry brush and use it to touch up those areas that you just couldn't get to with the larger surfaces. You can find soft eye makeup brushes like this on online retailers. I think I got this on Amazon in a kit of like 10, and it was about $10. You can see it's really starting to brighten up a lot of the edges, and that's really all I'm trying to do with this. The flat surfaces will be a little bit different in that you're going to have some modulation of the color from the maybe raised areas if that's the direction you go, and you do have some control over that as you're painting. I'm going to just hit them first just to kind of get every edge highlighted, and then I'll see about how it looks at the end. Let the paint dry because it will mute out slightly, and see as it looks if you're happy with it. I just take a peek every so often and just kind of figure out if I like where it's going. Also keep in mind, I know I do have a cut in this progression, but I only loaded this brush once. I actually never went back to the paint after the initial loading, so just keep in mind it doesn't take a lot of paint to get the desired effect. Now it's time to start the red details. I'm basically following the artwork on the Alpha Strike card. I'm using the blood red first. It's a little bit darker and I like the coverage that it gets. Also, if you don't want to do more than one layer of red, then I suggest you do the darker red that you might have available to you. Again, if you prefer a brighter red, that's fine. It will probably take a little bit more work to get that brighter red to be brighter, so since we're already painting over black, a little bit darker red, it kind of works hand in hand. Take your time with this, thin your paint a little bit with water. In most cases, you're going to need a little bit of water added to it just to get it to work the way you want on the brush. I'm just using my number 0 with a nice solid tip that hasn't been too abused. Reach the areas that you can, take your time, support the miniature, brace your fingers, pull towards yourself, all those rules that, you know, if you're painting freehand stripes and things like that, you would also apply here. And the artwork shows a pinstripe on the shoulders where you may decide you want to just do the outer ring that looks like a armor plate there separately, but of course I'm going to do the stripe on the inside just because I think it looks neat, and it's not something that I'm too concerned about not being able to do since I do stripes on a regular basis. But take your time with it if you do want to do it. Turn the model that's convenient for you and orient it so that you can see what you're working on. Adding these little red details should be the fun part of the miniature as you're getting close and it really starts to break out what the scheme looks like. So paint as much or as little of this as you want. Try out different techniques if you're wanting to expand your abilities, or just stick with what you know and move on to the next step. There's no wrong way to do it if you're enjoying it. If you decide to follow the artwork and do the front lip of this upper torso area, then I suggest you use the side of your bristles. Don't try to paint it directly straight. I'm just holding the brush perpendicular to the surface and going back and forth in smooth and light strokes just to get the paint to kind of convince itself to stay on those edges and not roll over the edge. If it does spill over a little bit, you can touch it up, and there'll be a demonstration of that here in a little bit. I'll show you what you can do to touch up some areas that you may not be happy with, but I think it's best to wait until you've done the red as well, simply because if you're touching it up, you might as well just do it once instead of putting red on and then finding out that there was an area that you fixed right near there and now you're fixing it again. The Black Widow's known for having a red hourglass painted on the center torso. The Direwolf doesn't really have the best center torso for that. You could do it kind of underneath the front canopy, but I think it's a bit more prominent and a little easier to paint. Well, certainly easier to paint down here on this center hip joint. It's still technically the center part of the mech, so I'm just painting a quick little triangle there, and I'm not too worried about it being a perfect triangle, you know, as far as matching both sides. In nature, the Black Widow Spider, the red hourglass, is actually never usually 100% symmetrical on either side, so I'll just chalk it up to that and obviously not hold myself to getting it perfect, especially since the top half is mostly not visible depending on the angle you're looking on at the mech. So, and then of course you got this gap right in the middle there, so it gets a little bit difficult to kind of fine point that, so don't stress out over it. I didn't, and it still looks really good, so just keep that in mind. If you want to do it, you can. If you want to paint it somewhere else, that's fine, but you can skip this completely if you really want, and people will still know who the pilot of that mech is. Still using my detail brush, I've got a little bit of the Army Painter dark tone. You can use Nuln Oil or any other black wash you prefer, and now I'm throwing it into the recessed areas with the metallics. This will set all that kind of in line with the rest of the miniature, darken it up. Now if you used a darker silver or a brighter silver, depending on it, you can use a brown wash, you can use a couple of coats of black wash, you can really just do whatever you prefer. And if you've got a process that you enjoy and that you find works best for you, this is the time to do it. I'm just showing that I've got these little silver and gunmetal details that I want to make a little bit more weathered and grimy and just kind of not as shiny and bright on the overall picture of the miniature. So that's why I'm putting a little bit of wash on here. It doesn't take very long. I'm not being extremely careful, because if the black runs into some of the other areas, hey, it's a black recess on a mech that's black, so can't really complain about any more of that. And here's where we're at. You can see there's some areas, particularly on the shoulder, where the blue-gray or the gray itself got a little bit too much kind of towards the elbow joint on that left shoulder, and I'm going to show you how to touch that up here in a little bit, but that's going to be the next step. If you're happy with the way it looks, this is a great place to stop. You've achieved everything you want to achieve. You've got the red, you've got the black. Seal it up and do the base and go on about your miniature painting experience there and do the little details and things like that. I'm going to take it just a little bit further and clean up some of these areas just to demonstrate how you can do that. I will also say that I went back and took a little bit more of that blue-gray and put a touch on the top torso panel there and added just a little bit more to kind of get a bit more fade. So you'll notice that as well. It looks a little bit smoother, and so I did that off camera. I've got some of the charcoal black, and I'm adding a bunch of water to it and thinned it out, and it's basically a glaze. And all I'm doing is going in and finding these areas that I think just got a little too bright, starting at the bottom, and just kind of quickly fixing things below that kind of median line. You can see I'm not paying a whole lot of time in each area to whether or not it's perfectly placed, because I'm really just letting the paint that's thinned go onto those areas and merge between the two colors, the darker black and charcoal and then the lighter gray, which is really what I'm trying to hide. The biggest areas were on this shin here, and you can see me now. I'm actually painting almost close to the edge, but I'm not really paying too much attention to it. I'm just kind of putting a little bit on and then moving on to another area. I'm focusing on those shoulder rings that I had mentioned earlier that I really wanted to clean up a little bit and break up some of that dry brush appearance that had basically a little bit of texture on it. So now I'm just kind of picking my way through other areas that I'm seeing here and there and just putting just a touch of quick thinned charcoal paint onto them. And it really is that easy. It's not anything you have to really get super technical with. You don't need to be very meticulous, and it doesn't take a whole lot. You may do 1 or 2 coats. It might take a couple of attempts there to smooth it out, but you're working with such a thin paint that it's to be expected. If you're covering it up with one layer, your paint's too thick. Now you could do this with a black wash if you decided to, use just a little bit on the brush so your brush isn't holding too much and it doesn't get away from you. I recommend the Army Painters just because it's a lot thicker and easier to work with in that regard, more predictable. But you could also do this exact same thing that way and it would still basically achieve the same type of effect. In the same vein of what we did with touching up the gray and the black, I've taken my brighter red, in this case Gory red, and I'm adding some water to it to thin it out. And now I'm going to put touches of it on the highest edges on my red to bring it out a little more. So this is just really bringing out some of that blood red using a brighter red over the top of it. Again, it's fairly thin. It's not quite glaze consistency, but it's a nice thinned layer. And what it'll allow you to do is, especially once you start to get to the raised high edges on the arms and on the shoulders, it'll really allow you to show some light activity that kind of goes in line with the grays and the highlights that we've already achieved using the dry brushing. I am being careful. I'm trying not to go all the way out to the outer edge. That helps also with transitioning from the dark black and gray into the dark red and then over to the brighter red. And it will mute out some. It's not going to be as bright as you think it will be. And once you see the finished photographs, you can be able to tell that it's been done, but it's also, I think, a stronger looking red, even though I like the way the dark red looks already. I'm just showing you that this is an option as well to bring out some of that. And if you want to expand on your painting skills and what the finished look will be, this is a easy way to do that, especially since it's such a small number of areas and it's not that time consuming. Again, I'm using a perpendicular type of approach to the outer edges here, and I'm really not focused on trying to cover the entire surface. I'm just kind of aiming towards the middle or the higher side towards the top of the mech, respectively. But I'm not getting too hung up on trying to make a fade or a blend or anything like that. I'm just going to put the paint on and let it do what it's going to do. And that's okay because it's still going to look good. And again, you're going to get some natural variations and you're not going to have to spend a whole lot more time doing anything else to it. Of course, you can always go back and touch it up more. And then the downside to painting those stripes would be that you get to go over them again. So practice them if you want, be bold about trying new things, but this would be a time when you probably would have wished that you painted the outer rings versus painting a freehand stripe on one side. But this is a good place for a stripe because you do have one edge that's basically a gimme and you're just worried about that inner side. You can see even there a little bit of a smudge. The paint's thin, be quick about it, or have a secondary brush or a cotton swab to use that's slightly moistened to move the paint off. And if you get a little bit onto the gray and the black, you know how to touch it up. And here's the nearly finished photograph. I've finished the stripes. I've added cockpit and laser jeweling as well as PPC glows. All of those things I have tutorials on the channel. You can search for those or see some of the links at the end of this video. I've also got decals, and then here you can see I've added the pigment and weathering to the base. I've trimmed up and painted the hex base itself with a matte coat, and I've added a gloss varnish to all the applicable areas that I want to have resemble glass. I'm really happy with the way this miniature turned out, especially using the techniques that were involved. We didn't have to use any washes and we didn't have to do any targeted blending or anything like that. I was able to achieve a decent blend without an airbrush. You should be happy if you've completed this whole tutorial. Congratulations. Tex, if you would please.
We certainly hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe and leave your questions or comments below. Follow us on Facebook at Battletech Camo Specs Online. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Shutdown sequence, whatever.